Welcome everyone to the Science and Society Network seminar. My name's Emma Koval. I am Professor of Anthropology here at Deakin in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I would like to first acknowledge the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I am really excited to be presenting our seminar today called Transforming the Pharmaceutical Landscape from and for Africa. And we have here in the flesh Professor Anne Pollock, who is a friend of the network, friend of Australia.
Absolutely.
Yep. And has been the keynote speaker for AusSTS in the past, which is the Australasian Science and Technology Studies graduate network. Yeah, we love to hear what Anne is up to. She is the Professor of Global Health and Social Medicine at King's College in London, and also Honorary Professor at the Sydney Centre for Healthy Societies.
Oh,
yes. She also currently serves as the President of the Society for Social Studies of Science, 4S, which I previously was. So we are bonded through administrative labour. She has 3 books and about to have a 4th. So her first book is Medicating Race, Heart Disease and Durable Preoccupations with Difference, published by Duke University Press in 2012. Her second book, Synthesizing Hope, Matter, Knowledge and Place in South African Drug Discovery, Chicago 2019. And I think the project she's presenting today kind of returns in some ways to that. Well, all of the books are beautifully connected, but that one, I suppose, in terms of place, that's where we're going back to. Her third book is called Sickening, Anti-Black Racism and Health Disparities in the United States, published by University of Minnesota Press, 2021. And that is has been really widely used in teaching about health disparities all around the world. And she actually has another book coming out this middle of the year, winter, southern winter, northern summer, called The Racial Cage, published by Minnesota Press, which is a collaborative book with 3 other colleagues. It's also fantastic. So please look that up. So her ongoing research engages with 3 intersecting areas: racism and health, feminist theory and biomedicine, and the social studies of pharmaceuticals. So the way it will work today is that Anne will soon present her work, and this is also the first time she's presented on this project, so that's really, really exciting to be hearing the hot off the press. Then afterwards, Laura Foster, who is joining us at a pretty horrific time of the day. So thank you so much, Laura. So I'll introduce her formally straight after the seminar, and she will present some discussant comments. And then we will have plenty of time for questions from people here in the room and also those who are watching online. So please engage in the chat, in the YouTube chat. Introduce yourself. Karina Traits, our amazing SSN coordinator, is there. And any questions you have, you can pop them in the chat during the talk or after the talk, and she can relay them to me. Okay, I think we are ready to go. So we're going to plug you in, Anne.
Fantastic.
And that's you. It's interesting.
Was working a moment ago. Let's see.
Maybe I'll.
Oh no, I'll just redo it. Here we go.
Okay, good.
Super. All right. So thank you so much for the kind introduction and for having me. And yes, and as Emma said, this is very much work in progress. So far, all I've presented is one 4S presentation together with my co-author, Lauren Paremoer. I'll talk a little bit about her as well. In work that is about transforming the pharmaceutical landscape from and for Africa. We're interested in re-emerging regional visions of pharmaceutical manufacturing for the common good. Now, this has been a topic that has been absolutely very much in the news in the past few weeks because of Trump's executive orders. And we know that when Trump says America first, it's not that everybody else is like equally last, but there are some kind of hierarchies to that. And many places in Africa, especially South Africa, where I have done a lot of work in the past and continue to work, have been very severely impacted by the freeze in aid. So by PEPFAR and by USAID, we are major providers, for example, of antiretrovirals in South Africa and also around the continent. But a lot of the kind of Northern American critique has been really problematic because what it has done is it really treats the Africans who are impacted by those cuts as pitiable objects of the kind of actions of Trump and Musk and so on, rather than as agential subjects who are also people who are making choices and wanting things and not merely passive. And I think, you know, these images, right, in the cartoons, these have been very widely circulated in the United States, which, as you can tell by the way I talk, is where I'm originally from. And, you know, really reprising images that are more familiar from maybe the 1980s and, you know, kind of configuring Africa as a place only of lack and only of desperate poverty, not also, you know, a highly dynamic place, you know, dozens of countries and so on. So the response from South Africans and others has been quite different. Talking about the ways that US aid cuts might offer also an opportunity to reimagine global health. And so, you know, really this kind of moment in which the US has radically kind of pared back aid and without warning, you know, and quite abruptly, has really shone a light on, wait a minute, why is it that so many people are dependent on unreliable bilateral arrangements with the United States you know, and even multilateral things that the United States has overwhelming power in, rather than having more self-sufficiency. And so it's really exposed issues in South African governance and the governance of other countries that, you know, folks are talking about, well, hey, we actually need our governments to take more responsibility for global health. And so this actually really relates quite directly to work that I've been doing with my collaborator, Lauren Paremoer, over the past several months. Lauren Paremoer is a senior lecturer at the University of Cape Town, and she's also active in the People's Health Movement in South Africa. And from the middle of the year, last year, we've been, so we started with key informant interviews with people who were involved in the Africa CDC's efforts to catalyze pharmaceutical manufacturing. So folks may have heard a little bit about this, but so Africa CDC has laid out a plan for a new public health order for Africa. And this was before the Trump cuts, right? And so, you know, before this current crisis, already there were previous crises that really catalyzed this effort to really bring more regional manufacturing around. And so this is something that we just started, and then we'll be doing some of the first field work on the ground coming up in April. But the key informant interviews have already been really compelling in hearing why it is that folks who are involved with these efforts to try to build local pharmaceutical manufacturing across the continent, why they think that's necessary, why they think this is the right historical moment, what might make it possible in the post-pandemic era. And so in Lauren and my collaboration, it's really come together through these longstanding research interests that we have. So for me, in my second book, which Emma mentioned, Synthesizing Hope, one of the core questions was about how does it matter who makes knowledge and where? So the idea that maybe, you know, pharmaceutical knowledge and scientific knowledge, perhaps more broadly, often seems to flow only, okay, it'll be made in the global north or not, and the challenge is just to spread the benefit. But does it matter? Something a bit more upstream. And then also aspirations for marshaling African science for the benefit of African people. This is particularly poignant in a place like South Africa, which of course built a robust scientific infrastructure under apartheid, where science was serving a minority and not serving the majority. And there's lots of challenges in a kind of post-structural adjustment global order to having a democratic state serve the people in this way, but this aspiration is still very lively. And then for Lauren's work, she's had a long-standing interest in realizing access to health for the Global South. And then also from a kind of a political studies perspective, thinking through the solidarities and the sovereignties that are emerging in the multilateral global order. So, and some of it is quite 70s-tastic, I would say. So, you know, really thinking through the new economic international order from the 1970s and then, you know, on through today. To situate this a little bit further, let me say at least a little bit about my earlier work. So this is where the kind of basis of my second book, a place called Atemba Pharmaceuticals. And Atemba is Zulu for hope. And so what they were trying to do was to make new drugs for TB, HIV, and malaria in the outskirts of Johannesburg. So folks who are familiar with Joburg's architecture will really recognize the kind of security theater and this like it's actually rather bucolic. I mean, that picture is from winter, but it was quite leafy in summer. And so this particular site I thought was interesting, right? With this, they were trying to make inexpensive therapy for infectious disease through innovative chemistry. And so I thought that this kind of combination was really compelling because often when we think about inexpensive therapy, we think about generics. We don't think about innovative drugs. And, you know, so this combination of the inexpensive and the innovative, and then of course, infectious diseases is the effort to be really locally relevant. Of course, I'm speaking in the past tense about this, not only because the book is already written, but also because the book has a tragic end. The company went out of business. It did not discover new drugs for TB, HIV, and malaria that are now made or something, right? It's a tragic end to the story. And yet, what I end that book on, right? So after talking about why there was hope in South African drug discovery, questioning this idea that knowledge would be made in the global north and the only challenge is to spread the benefit, this aspiration for a South African science that would serve the South African majority rather than only the white minority, aspirations for African solutions to African problems, and many of the scientists were from other countries in Africa, so this kind of Pan-African realization as well. And Hope and Flow is about green chemistry, which I remain interested in. So these ideas that environmentally sound pharmaceutical manufacturing might be a competitive advantage for places without robust infrastructures. But I ended that book thinking about afterlives of hope. And, you know, so the kind of continuing efforts that happen even after the company fails. And part of that is about the infrastructure that continues to exist. And part of that is about the human capital that exists. Part of it is about the progress that's made in terms of ideas as well. And I've certainly seen in these conversations now that the kind of both the physical materials and the ideas that gathered and coalesced at Atemba for a period have not been completely lost. Those afterlives are present in the ongoing work now, especially as African pharma manufacturing is a domain that has been really revitalized in the post-pandemic period. So where before, you know, lots of people were trying to make this stuff happen from the early 2000s and various periods, but there was really a fluorescence in the early 2000s and into kind of the 2010 period, which is when I started my research. And but it's really being revitalized now because of course, the South African metaphor is present as well when we heard about vaccine apartheid. And so, what we saw, in the COVID pandemic, was that there was a lot of outrage from various people engaging with global health about the fact that many global north countries, and actually Australia was impacted by this to some degree too, which is interesting too, to think about, the way that these lines of distribution are complex. So countries like the United Kingdom, across the EU, the United States were hoarding vaccines, and people elsewhere didn't have access. And this was widely decried as vaccine apartheid. And this was particularly stark in Africa, where even healthcare workers didn't have access to vaccine and became, a real target of outrage. And this, in turn, led to efforts to really build vaccine manufacturing capacity more than there is now in South Africa, well, in Africa as a whole, and including in South Africa. And potentially thinking through the mRNA technology as a hub. And so Lauren and I have written just a little bit about this with the mRNA hub at Afrigen, which is in Cape Town. And it's a really interesting project because what they did there was that they replicated the Moderna vaccine. And they chose that one because Moderna had said that they wouldn't enforce IP during the pandemic. And so there was a little bit more room to maneuver and so on. So they could, but they didn't reverse engineer exactly. They used publicly available information in order to, things that have been published, academic papers that have been published and so on, to replicate the vaccine. And were successful. And they have a very compelling director who has an interesting articulation of this that we understand as decolonial aspiration. I mean, that's not quite her word, but it's almost, right? It's almost her word around dismantling an unequal global order through a hub and spokes model of technology transfer around mRNA vaccines. One thing that's interesting to note with the mRNA hub is that they're not only looking to make COVID vaccines, but to use mRNA as a platform to develop new vaccines. So we all know that, or maybe we don't know, but it is the case that TB vaccines are not good enough. And there's a need for better vaccines for tuberculosis, especially for immunocompromised folks or people on antivirals. And so, they would be able to, hopefully use a platform for innovation as well for vaccines that are not in this high demand from global pharma. And so, this idea that you could change that landscape of pharmaceutical and vaccine innovation and distribution together is something that was really coming to a head in the development of the mRNA hub, which is ongoing. I mean, it's still a space to watch. And it also came to the fore with Africa CDC. So Africa CDC had been founded initially during the Ebola outbreak, because there was a recognition that it was not enough to have surveillance individual countries in order to deal with infectious disease outbreaks, but that you needed some kind of coordinating agency who could work across the borders of Liberia and Sierra Leone and Nigeria and so on in order to actually realize the potential that is necessary, right? But this came, there was after COVID and the experience of the lack of vaccine access, then this became a real, it was recognized that surveillance was not enough. If you don't have the technologies that you can actually use to address the public health situation, then, surveillance is not going to be enough. So you need to be able to make diagnostics locally, you need to be able to make basic therapeutics locally, add vaccines locally. And so, and locally here means regionally, right? So not every nation state on its own, but Africa CDC, like the African Union, out of which it's kind of formed, is based on Addis Ababa. And so, this was a kind of moment that they were trying to call for a new public health order. So this is what they called it in 2022. And the new public health order would be not one that was vulnerable to those issues that have come up with Trump's executive orders, right, would be one, that there would be sustainability and robustness and more independence. And it has these pillars, right, so they want to have strong African public health institutions, really prioritizing African priorities and global health governance, and expanded manufacturing of vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics, investment in public health workforce and leadership, increased domestic investment in health, and then respectful action-oriented partnerships. So not ones that would be, so unequal and determined solely by rich countries in the global north. And of course, these are all interconnected, right? So the workforce is necessary for the manufacturing, is necessary for the partnerships. So these things, kind of came together in this historical moment. And so we're going to include just a few quotes from some of the key informant interviews, which we did online in the middle of last year. And so one of the key informants talked to us about, and this kind of theme came up a lot, that the Africa CDC emerged out of an emergency, which was the Ebola outbreak, just like the focus on manufacturing now came out of another emergency, which is the COVID-19 pandemic. And so this is kind of a recognition of the timeliness of the issue, at the same time that there is this kind of risk of only responding to emergencies being like necessarily vulnerable, right? And so, there is an acute crisis in global health funding. So in these past few weeks, and in COVID and in Ebola and in, we see it repeatedly. But I think what this kind of repeated emergency shows is that business as usual actually wasn't working as well as it should have before. It wasn't like things were fine before Trump was reelected. And in no small part, that vulnerability, that precarity was related to the fact that it didn't prioritize Africans as makers, not of knowledge about health and not of essential goods that would foster health. And I think that it's worthwhile to kind of take stock, even among the left or among progressives or whatever I imagine many of us might align with, to see how that's true, actually, not only of kind of the big bad guys, but also of the good guys. So the Universities Allied for Essential Medicines is a group that I've followed, since I did my PhD at MIT, where there was a lot of interest in these conversations as well, because Boston is such a hub of things that lead to drug discovery and could have a value. But I think that the Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, which is great, but their motto here, right? Our drugs, our labs, our responsibility, is actually a little bit problematic, because it's assuming that the only place that drugs can be made is in the labs in the global north, right? That might be an ungenerous reading. And it is true that there were some issues around manufacturing recognized as well as IP from the beginning. So I don't know if folks are familiar with Universities Allied for Essential Medicines. I know that it is here as well, in Sydney at least. But this is their motto, right? And it was founded in 2001 by a group of Yale students because Yale owned the patent for a particular antiretroviral drug that could be used in a triple cocktail. And so there was a pressure point that was possible, right? Because then the Yale students could say, Yale, you need to do something about this. You own the patent. You need to release it, right? But Bristol Myers Squibb had been licensed the patent. And so originally Yale said, well, you can't do anything about it. Eventually they were successful. And this is actually one of the few times when, so Universities Allied for Essential Medicines, actually, they always said either release the IP so that they can make it in South Africa, or they can import it from elsewhere. And actually, in this case, they did manufacture it in South Africa, but most of the antiretrovirals weren't, and they remain imported. And certainly the APIs and so the active pharmaceutical ingredients, they rely on importing and don't necessarily have local manufacturing capacity. And so the focus has been only on spreading intellectual property, not necessarily on spreading the know-how to make pharmaceuticals. I think this is related, right, to an issue with the way that these are set up. And this is a current map of UAEM. So they have, this is where their chapters are. So these are where university students have said, okay, we want to be allied for essential medicines. We want to promote access. We want to make sure that things that are discovered at university campuses. I've done a lot of work with a scientist who's based at Emory. So this is a very, live issue in many universities. And yet it's a problem, right? That these are not involving Africans in the conversation at the start, right? So the obvious lack of coverage there in Africa. There's a few Latin American branches, which is great. It's also interesting to me that there's none in India. There's none in other kind of key places that are important in the pharmaceutical supply chain. But leaving that aside, I think, so what this kind of points to is not that, oh, they're terrible. They're not. They do an important role and they make an important intervention. But I think that there's still more to be done. And so, from that, as one of our key informant interviews said, I think the most important value that I can focus on is African ownership and African leadership, which actually touches a bit on the second independence of Africa that is being talked about. So this is what the director of the Africa CDC talks about. So he says that local manufacturing is the second independence of Africa. So it must not be driven from outside. It has been. It has to be driven from inside for it to be sustainable and for it to be effective. And here, this is again something that's long been talked about, but becomes newly salient after COVID. So we've been aware for a long time of the limits of relying on India as the pharmacy of the developing world. And so this is a, kind of an image from Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières. They, have had this campaign for a long time to make sure that Indian generic companies can export their drugs, affordable antiretrovirals, especially to other countries, including South Africa, which has strong IP laws in some senses. But the problem is, right, if you're relying on a pharmacy of the pharmacy of the developing world, you are reliant on them to set the priorities of who, which drugs they want to provide, to whom, what's the most important market to serve. And so even India serves other markets first, not Africa first, right? So Africa often gets the leftovers and can be very vulnerable to, there's lots of issues. We can talk about that later if folks are interested, but a couple to highlight. And so another key informant talked about, when it comes to local manufacturing, there's a discussion of how do you, or how you define it as local manufacturing. Is it African? Is growing African companies, or is it multinationals moving their base from elsewhere and coming into the continent? Because let's remember, when we were looking at local manufacturing drive on the continent, the primary goal is to improve access, right? However, as you may recall, I'll give an example of COVID. India, at the very beginning, when it comes to vaccines, there were companies, multinationals that invested in India, and they were using the base of India to manufacture, but the manufacturing was for elsewhere. So we may fall into the same trap that we can manufacture as a continent. And this was a really rough thing to watch, I think, during COVID, when we saw so many Indians falling ill and dying, and rich countries were saying, well, we have a contract. And so the problem is actually even deeper than that as well, because it doesn't only affect the COVID vaccines, but it also affects other drugs too. So another informant talked about one thing that COVID did was to open the eyes of many countries, many leaders. Let's look, for example, at the small molecule space. So this is ordinary drugs, not fancy mRNA vaccines. So China has been the dominant player in starting materials, intermediates, and API, which is active pharmaceutical ingredients. And Indian pharma, for example, depended on China. So especially products based on fermentation. So that is when COVID plants shut down and there were export restrictions. So India couldn't get the ingredients that it needed in order to manufacture, right? And so they did actually do a big amount of work in order, the government did invest to develop new API parks and these other investments to make Indian pharma more robust and making earlier stage ingredients, so to be less reliant on China. And if you look at the Europe and the US now, there's a massive, big move to bring back manufacturing, especially ingredients and intermediates. So this has been a global kind of phenomenon. And so Africa has not been spared from that. So, Africa is locked out of supply chains and couldn't compete on price. So if there's a bidding war, right, the United States is generally going to win, and the EU is going to do well as well. And so Africa were at the back of the queues. Factories shut down, there were export restrictions, there were usual suppliers. And so this narrative of India being the pharmacy of the developing world was found wanting. So if you can only serve some of your customers, who are you going to prioritize? So Africans are not going to be necessarily entirely self-sufficient, but at least they have to build some modicum of self-sufficiency against priority things. So antiretrovirals, of course, comes up a lot because when the rubber hits the road, countries will look after their own first. And so this is where there's this aspiration for regional agency over the full value chain of pharmaceuticals, vaccines, diagnostics, and other health technologies. So at least some regional agency over basic research, over clinical trials, over manufacturing, over procurement, and over distribution. Now, an obvious challenge with this is that usually when we talk about this, we talk about it at the level of the nation state. Africa is not a nation state, right? And so it is kind of similar in size to it's a growing market, unlike other markets. So, where the population of other places is decreasing, the population in Africa is increasing. And there is, potentially a lot of potential there, but it requires significant coordination in order to realize it. So, most countries in Africa are not big enough to be able to sustain a whole diversified pharmaceutical industry the way that India can, right? I mean, so India is also 1 billion people. And so versus if they could coordinate, that becomes more possible. And so this is where, a big value that folks talk about. So in addition to African agency, a lot of the key informant interviews talk about Ubuntu, right? Which is a collective sensibility. I am because we are is a common way of translating it. No person comes into existence independent of other human beings, right? All human beings owe something to each other. There's an ethos of generosity. I mean, there's layers, right? Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, like kind of that generation, were very into articulating these things. And then thinking about whether there is a way that this could be more fully realized in this post-pandemic space. And it's kind of finishing a journey that started, a long time ago, right? So with the Treatment Action Campaign, which was advocating for access to antiretrovirals in India or in South Africa, and then was very much kind of in conversation, so a very local kind of activist movement but that was part of a global network connected to the Doctors Without Borders campaigns, right? So in the same period. And when you look at the activism that was there in the late 1990s and early 2000s in South Africa, you saw these things happening together, right? So challenging the individual nation to be accountable, right? So the individual state to not be in AIDS denialism, HIV denialism, and challenging the profiteering that pharmaceutical companies were doing, as there was this kind of contest between patent rights and patient rights. And this came to the fore. I mean, people may remember this, that it really came to the fore in a case that came to be called Big Pharma versus Nelson Mandela, actually. So this is the next slide. This is all from the Doctors Without Borders history of their campaign. And so in 1997, South Africa wanted to import antiretrovirals from India. India wanted to sell it to them, but a whole bunch of pharmaceutical companies, and it was led by Al Gore. I mean, again, it's not only the big bad guys who play formulaic roles here. And obviously that's not good PR, Big Pharma versus Nelson Mandela in that period. And so, and what did happen, and they were successful. I mean, so actually, the Big Pharma had to drop the case. And India and South Africa was allowed to import affordable drugs. And yet, this is an unfinished process. And this really gets us to this moment we're at now. So what wound up happening was that access to antiretrovirals was secured for South Africans at least, and in many parts of the continent. And it was secured through things like PEPFAR, so the United States President Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which was George W. Bush, and through USAID, which we know has been cut now too. And so that this, and Global Fund, which US is a big contributor to as well. So it really, created this reliance on aid in order to fill this. And it also, all these donors have a lot of prerequisites on what they will allow to be used, and a real preference for Indian suppliers is what winds up happening. So the dependence on donations has meant that there is a lack of self-determination for South Africans and across the continent. And what key informants that we interviewed noted is that governments are finally starting to move away from considering price alone when assessing whether to purchase a particular pharmaceutical, to awareness of the economic multipliers of local manufacturing and value of security of supply. So I couldn't find like an easy quote, but I'll kind of put this up because people tell like a long story about this. But I mean, one way to think about it, for example, is, if either a charity or a government is buying, let's say, antiretrovirals at a very large quantity, generally they would not be willing to pay any premium for local manufacture. And it's very difficult for any local manufacturer to sell it at as low a price as someone who's been in the market for a long time could do, right? So Indian manufacturers are going to beat them on price every time. But now, and especially post-COVID, there's increasing recognition among governments that maybe it's worth the 15% premium for local manufacture for a couple of reasons. One, you might have more control over the supply, so including quality control as well as regularity of access. And two, it's kind of an obvious thing in industrial policy, and industrial policy has become hot kind of around the world post-COVID as well, where if then you're paying somebody 15% more who's in your economy, who's paying taxes, who's sending their kids to school, who's buying services and so on, right? So that they're that rather than only seeing local production as more expensive, seeing it as like having multiplier effects across the economy, as well as improving the security of supply. So these two things kind of come together. Doesn't make it easy though, right? So there's a lot of barriers to entry in the pharmaceutical industry. So one is investment capital. And this is a huge problem in Africa because often there is not the trust and the regulatory regimes, and there's a lot of concern around corruption. There's a lot of concern about lots of different issues. And so there needs to be a trusted broker for foreign direct investment or for other forms of capital to be raised. Other issue I mentioned, it's kind of implied before around economies of scale. So, and when you first start making something, it's going to be more expensive than after you've actually made more. And then also if you're serving a small market versus a large one. So there's two elements to that. If you can have purchase guarantees where, a government or an aid agency says, if you make this, I will buy a lot of it. Then you can reach these economies of scale in a way that you can't if you're just kind of starting small and building up. IP is something that folks have talked a lot about and is certainly an important barrier, but there's also things like trade secrets. And this is where things like the mRNA hub are so important because, the thing with intellectual property is it is more public in the sense, right? People publish the patent, so other people can see what that is. But a lot of the pharmaceutical industry is actually protected through trade secrets that are never patented because they don't want to publish them, right? And so if you have these kind of training mechanisms, you can have a much easier time sharing. And then the regulations and approvals, and this really gets to this issue of how many, the problem that it is, there are more than 50 countries in Africa. Regulatory harmony, like making the regulations harmonized so that a manufacturer in one country in Africa can sell in others, so that you have a larger market that you can work with. And it has to be a trusted regulatory regime. And many countries, of course, don't have trusted regulatory regimes. And that's what leads to the interest in Pan-African moves. And so one other thing I think just to kind of highlight as well that I think is an important element of this is that there's a tension between the G20 framing versus the G7. So the G7 being the most industrialized countries and then the G20. So Brazil wants to propose an alliance that supports diseases. So this is like drugs for diseases for neglected populations. Whereas G7 says, no, just neglected diseases. And this, they take the population out and they cement the world just as it is, right? And I think that there's something, really interesting happening where we say, actually, it's not because Africans have different diseases. I mean, sometimes they do, right? There are certainly neglected diseases that are overrepresented in Africa. But it's also the case that no matter what the disease, many African populations broadly are underserved. And so how can that be changed? That can be changed arguably through greater agency. So this is where there's this revaluing of African health security. So part of what Africa CDC and others are trying to do is do something scalar. So they're trying to articulate industrial policy beyond the nation state. So not only South Africa should do something differently, or Nigeria, Rwanda is an important player in this space, despite being so small. There's so there's a scalar effort that's taking place. So trying to have industrial policy happen at a continental level, even for a continent which isn't a single country. There's also a temporal element here. So trying to move beyond solving this emergency right now, stopgap, and fostering a longer term investment in Africans' health. And so, this is where I think, part of what's happening here is that at the same time that they're trying to revalue pharmaceuticals and say, okay, it's worth the 15% premium. If we know the quality is good, and we know the supply will be secure and it's investing in our economy, it also is re-articulating the value of Africans' lives. So these two things are happening together. And I think, the last thing, just to kind of note around how this is fitting into Lauren's and my work going forward, is these aspirations for a pharma industry that might serve the common good. We've recently put in a British Academy conference proposal that, if successful, will be held in 2026, hopefully in Nairobi, where we would bring together people from around the world, especially in Brazil and in various places, who are who are following all the effort, like really diverse and interesting efforts that people are doing around the world to try to reorient the pharmaceutical industry toward health priorities rather than just toward profit. And then also sovereignties beyond bilateralism. So really realizing some kind of more democratic sovereignty, and then also solidarities that are beyond the nation states. So I'll leave it there and welcome. I'll actually that out.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Anne, that was amazing, and lots and lots to talk about. So to get the conversation going, we're going to start with comments from Laura Foster. So I'll just introduce her. She is Associate Professor of Gender Studies and affiliate faculty in the Maurer School of Law and Program of African Studies at Indiana University, Bloomington in the US. So she's joining us at quite
Uncivilized,
ungodly. That's not right. She is also a senior researcher with the Intellectual Property Unit at the University of Cape Town Faculty of Law. Her research explores relationships of technoscience, governance, gender, race, and plants within South Africa. She is known, and I also know her, for her 2017 book, Reinventing Kudia, People's Plants and Patents in South Africa, which examines struggles over patent law, pharmaceutical drug making, and Indigenous knowledge as a site for understanding changing South African politics. So, Laura, please, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, great. So thank you so much to the organizers and Karina and Emma for inviting me to be a discussant today, and to Anne Pollock for your really thought-provoking remarks. You have a lot for us to kind of go off of and talk about. So I just wanted to kind of start by highlighting a few things that just resonated the most with me in the talk as kind of a way to frame. And then I have like 3 kind of questions that we might use to kind of frame a discussion. So, I mean, I felt like Professor Pollock did a really thorough job and expertly kind of engaging with longstanding tensions between kind of the global north, African healthcare systems, pharmaceutical knowledge production, and really detailing, right, these efforts by and for Africans to develop really kind of an alternative vision of global health. And, you mentioned at the end, right, this prioritizing of common good. You mentioned quite a bit about sort of this idea of sovereignty and self-determination in terms of scientific knowledge production, and these aspirations that are really thinking in terms of like decolonial aspirations for knowledge projects. And so I thought it was really interesting that you and rightly situate these aspirations and efforts within kind of the politics of global health right now. So, really we saw from, and as you mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted how African nations are, were really sidelined and marginalized within global vaccine access. And, you had the Western pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Moderna, resisting that technology transfer, but also resisting intellectual property, which you mentioned, and these elements of control, right? Who's sort of controlling these life-saving pharmaceutical industries. And then I also, framing it within kind of the recent US foreign aid cuts and how that exposes kind of the vulnerability of African health systems that have been historically structured for various reasons and legacies of colonialism and power around kind of foreign assistance. And I liked too that you pointed out in the talk that even kind of liberal critiques right now of those US cuts to foreign aid are continuing, right? These historical legacies of treating Africans as deserving of pity, as you mentioned, and not agential subjects. And so really it's kind of this backdrop that you situate the efforts right now in terms of the scientific sovereignty, in terms of the mRNA hub, and thinking about how that is really representing kind of this radical shift towards African-led, Pan-African-led pharmaceutical production. And it's, I'm also thinking about the hub and how it's the shift, right? And this opposition to Western pharmaceutical companies and those companies' refusals to consider TRIPS intellectual property waivers. And how they're sort of refusing the technology transfer and the knowledge transfer, as you say. And so it really showcases kind of how African scientists are innovating independently, building local research productions and capacity. And also not just the hub, but kind of also the African CDC, which I think you mentioned a lot of your interviews right now are coming from, that are also supporting this shift. And sort of this initially, it was, I think you mentioned, created out of the response to the Ebola virus. But now it's kind of serving as this kind of platform and key driver of like, what would kind of this innovative global health policy look like? And so I liked thinking about your remarks in terms of like the sort of decolonizing of global health. So really, I also noted in your talk, there's a shift in kind of key values and interests with the production here. And so I was particularly struck by the one informant who was really emphasizing these values of African ownership, African leadership, and this idea of the second independence movement, I thought was really intriguing. And so really which is enabling this shift, like you mentioned, away from bilateral dependencies towards solidarities. And so like African sovereignty and solidarities beyond the nation state to create this sort of Pan-African knowledge-making practices. And so I think in terms of questions, these were just some things that I was thinking about when you were mentioning it. Is one, like the first question I had is really kind of centered around epistemic hierarchies that we might want to talk about. So this discussion of African self-determination and vaccine development, right? It sort of represents this break from global North dependencies and the foreign aid. But also, how is this push for African scientific sovereignty also challenging or reconfiguring epistemic structures of Western dominated biosciences and their ways of knowing. So how is it also kind of changing the epistemic structures of pharmaceutical knowledge making? And I think the second thing I was curious about is kind of thinking about institutional and epistemic hierarchies. So, pharmaceutical knowledge production I'm sort of curious about where the scientific knowledge production is happening across the continent, because from what I know, it's still largely produced in elite research institutions, even within Africa. And so my question is kind of how is the pursuit of this innovation here kind of challenging epistemic hierarchies and institutional structures within Africa and across Africa? So for example, like how are more kind of local universities being brought into these networks, community-based researchers? How is like non-Western or indigenous medical traditions being included or not within these aspirations for pharmaceutical knowledge networks or not, right? Sort of like how is this kind of question of who gets to be a producer of pharmaceutical knowledge within this kind of Pan-African vision is one question I had. And then kind of my third question was kind of about South scientific collaborations and kind of hierarchies across the global South and Africa itself. So I'm thinking about, let's think about maybe the hierarchies that are created within those and or challenged. So like how are pharmaceutical hubs that are in India or Brazil are they shaping what counts as valid pharmaceutical knowledge making within this space? And like, are they creating kind of what is considered valid knowledge production, contrasting with other nations in the global South that have less institutional infrastructures? Or like, for example, in South Africa, right? So you've got the pharmaceutical hubs in South Africa, and then how does that complicate potentially these aspirations for kind of this Ubuntu collective sensibility to this Pan-African pharmaceutical industry that you're saying like really is shifting beyond the nation state, but still how is the nation state coming in and complicating that and kind of these distinctions across institutions and infrastructures in those different countries. So Anne, thank you. It was a very thought-provoking and I'm really looking forward to kind of seeing where it goes. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Those are excellent questions. Yeah, I mean, I think that the epistemic hierarchies is important, right? So, I mean, one of the things that, I guess there's a few different ways to think about that. I mean, one way is about like who can authorize things. So I think there's parallel paths happening. I mean, so one of the big barriers to African manufacturing is that most aid agencies won't buy from anybody who is not WHO pre-qualified. And that's very expensive. It's very difficult for a factory to, any would-be manufacturer to kind of get that certification. And there's a big barrier to entry. Could there be regional alternatives? But I think that it's kind of left up in the air. I mean, some people are pursuing how can we actually make the WHO pre-qualification, how can we facilitate that? How can we work across scale and so on? And then others are thinking about how can we have an independent kind of authorizer, so like the FDA or like the EMA or one of the other kind of globally recognized, assessors. And so, I think that it's important, I think, that both of those are being pursued, right? So both to kind of participate in the kind of global like the epistemological kind of hierarchy as it is now, and to think about what might be otherwise in the longer term. I mean, it is tricky, right, with pharmaceuticals. I mean, people want trust. I mean, it would be great if things could be WHO pre-Q. So that would make people feel more reassured in it. But maybe those things are just unnecessary gates that are keeping out excellent local manufacturers too. So I mean, I think that those two things are happening together. the institutional and epistemic hierarchies, I agree, are really interconnected. And I think that part of the thing that's been interesting is one of the things that's happened with interest, like a lot of the informants talked about how, Africa's a great place to do this work because we have a growing population, we have lots of young people bring ideas, young people bring energy, all this stuff, the potential for a demographic dividend, which was achieved in, what were called the Asian tigers in the 1990s, where they had a higher portion of working age population relative to others. But that only works if people have the skills and their jobs are available, right? So then you have a higher age working population. But if all the young people are unemployed, then it doesn't work, right? And this is not just elite universities. This is actually also because it's the technicians too. It's we're not just talking about drug discovery. We're talking about someone will be, working on very basic levels of analysis within the plants. Someone will be working more advanced, right? All the way from school leavers who might do an internship kind of, apprenticeship type program to work as technicians on through postdocs, who would come back from Cambridge or whatever, right? Either Cambridge, really. And then also to South Africa, to South African universities and other, kind of elite universities within the continent. And I think that those things are happening, kind of at the same time as well, partly because they recognize if you're going to actually be able to, really make sure that the potential that of all that youth is realized, and also maybe stem some immigration and, keep the talent in Africa, it has to be at all levels. It can't only be postdocs, right? I mean, it's not everyone's going to be a postdoc. And the South-South collaborations and hierarchies across the global South is a really interesting one. And this is something that, I can't speak definitively about this yet because it's too early stage in the research. But one of the things I'm interested in figuring out more about is why is South Africa so game to be part of this, right? Because South Africa is one of the only places that could go alone, Nigeria is also very big, but they really face regulatory issues, right? So they just don't have the kind of regulatory infrastructure that would allow them. And they also have real problems with their electrical grid. South Africa does too, but South Africa is very good at hierarchy and making sure that it gets the electricity where they really want it, even if they don't necessarily get it to the whole population. So it's interesting. They have been, right? It really does seem that many South Africans, and a part of it is just random things, I think, like historical accidents. So the fact that the South African president happened to be, the presidency of the African Union shifts around the continent. And it happened to be that when the pandemic broke out, it was the South African president. And he was really on board with this. And I feel like, it's really an interesting thing to see because Pan-Africanism has been an elite discourse, right? So South Africans, overall, there's a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment in South Africa. So against other Africans who are coming to South Africa for opportunities. Pan-Africanism has always been very associated with elites, including Nelson Mandela, including, the kind of ANC broadly. Is there any hope for a Pan-Africanism that is less elite? This is kind of a question that I think we'll have to wait to see whether that is true or not. So I guess I'll leave it there for now and welcome other questions. Okay. So thank you so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Laura. And so we can keep the conversation going. I definitely have questions. There might also be other questions in the room. Does anyone? So I might get things going. Do you?
No, you go first.
Oh, well, there's so many really fascinating issues that this comes up in. That your talk raises, and I suppose, yeah, and it's just become so much like front page news issues since the end of January. But a couple of things. So I think I can't help seeing this as like another part of the end of the international order, end of the post-World War II consensus, kind of like the failure. And that's both from a social science perspective. All the stuff you you were kind of drawing on, which are critiques of development. Like, yeah, when you look at that Essential Medicines website, it does, yeah, it reads so badly.
Yeah.
Like, our medicines, you know, it's our responsibility to help those poor starving Africans. And I think, I mean, you know, we now, since the 90s and really before that, 80s, and the kind of rise of East Asian electronics. Now we've got you know, Indian drugs, Chinese electric vehicles, and solar panels. Like, we just you know, we just accept that they're really good at making that stuff. And so where I'm going with that is, like, you talked about the second independence of Africa. And you could argue that what Trump is trying to do is a new independence of the US. I mean, that's the whole MAGA thing, I suppose, is that, you know, it's everyone wants to do sovereign manufacturing. So, yeah, is this just another part of that, you know, very scary story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I mean, I think one of the elements I think that's been underappreciated in the craziness of Trump is the way that the centrality of industrial policy was actually already turned to Biden, right? So Biden was already interested in you know, onshoring more manufacturing in the United States, and was already interested in these things. I mean, this is something that is a much larger phenomenon and is connected to COVID, and it's also connected to, I mean, nostalgia, and it's connected. I mean, there's a lot of different things that I think that it's connected to, but it is a you know, potentially, if we imagine, I mean, so there are historians talking about this, right, of like these like kind of eras of the New Deal as one consensus, which then faded in the 1970s as kind of the shortcomings of the New Deal emerged. So this is obviously a very US-centric narrative. But I think broadly, right, if you mentioned like kind of social democracy has emerged after World War II, you know, in rich countries, there was a belief that, okay, well, this is what we need to do in order to have, you know, benefits for more people. This starts to break down in the 70s, and you see a rise, certainly with Reagan and Thatcher and others, of a neoliberal consensus. And that is breaking down. But whether the neoliberal consensus will end in a way, like which way it will go, I think is what's up for grabs. And I think one of the big differences between the kind of MAGA approach to sovereignty and what Africa CDC and these others related to the African Union, but other organizations as well, are doing is that so what the MAGA wants to do is all bilateralism. So, you know, they want it to be, everybody has to do one-to-one negotiations with the United States. You want access to the most powerful economy in the world, you need to play by our terms, right? And there's actually no order beyond the nation state whatsoever, right? It kind of obliterates that. Whereas what this is trying to do is work above the nation state as well, but in kind of cooperation. There's no cooperation in the MAGA order, you know, and there's no solidarity either. There's nobody with whom there is solidarity. It's just transactional, right? So if we can get a good deal, we do. And maybe, I mean, maybe that overstates the difference to some degree. I mean, certainly like, I mean, I had a funny experience where a colleague who does research at the European Medicines Authority, she was texting me. She was like, I'm listening to the head of the German Development Bank talk about why they're investing all these tens of millions of euros in African manufacturing. He says it's because the health of none of us is secure if the health of any of us is, you know, and health is a human right. And, you know, she's like, well, I think that, but does the head of the German Development Bank think that? And one of the things that our key informants talked about a lot with that was that actually Europe is looking to nearshore. So, you know, Europe was behind in the queue relative to the United States in the pandemic. And so it wants to friendshore and nearshore and have more kind of sources of supply. It's very expensive to reindustrialize Europe. Maybe you could industrialize Africa more, especially former colonies, and have different kind of relationships. I mean, I think that there's some of that is transactional, but I think that there is also something about, you know, a larger than narrow self-interest element that I think is the key differentiation. But that's something, it's a great point that I need to think more about how to make it clear this is not MAGA.
Yeah, but I mean, and Australia is also similarly the kind of make things in Australia again is something that's been proposed by the current progressive government. And yeah, and actually, if you haven't seen this Netflix documentary called American Factory, have you guys heard of that one? It's just a few years old. It's a really amazing documentary about a Chinese solar panel. No, it's a Chinese like glass for the automotive industry factory in the US, like that took over. I don't know, it's probably in Michigan.
Which is where I'm
which is
originally
where
from.
I'm pointing it, and it's Michigan. And
Michigander.
Michigan, yeah. And so a big General Motors factory closed down, as many factories are. So this Chinese company came and made a factory. And it's really fascinating, and really raises these questions of, can the US reindustrialize? And it's the same, like, so Deakin, the university that we're all at right now, our kind of biggest and kind of legacy campus is in Geelong, which is like the second big city in Victoria in this state. And it's very much a post-industrial city. And, it's full of like factories that are now kind of what government funded innovation hubs that are trying to generate. Yeah. So does anyone want to take that conversation on? Or bring something new? You look like you want to say
Yeah.
something.
Go for
Yeah,
it.
no,
Yeah.
I don't have any big questions. I have lots of little questions.
Yeah.
Sorry, they might seem like asides in a way.
No,
I was
great.
I was wondering if in your research, particularly your interviews, the idea of kind of clinical trials in Africa came up a lot, because
lot.
that's something that was always talked about, that drugs are tested on African bodies a lot of the time, or not just drugs, any kind of
Yeah.
medical technologies, and how that would seem to be kind of an advantage Africa has in terms of development
Disease
of,
prevalence. And
yeah. Yeah, so I just wondered, because I've kind of lost touch with these kind of things
No,
in recent
absolutely.
years, so it's you're bringing them up again.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, I think that's been one of the things that when we talk to them about, like, how do African values matter, if at all, right? One of the things that they talk about actually is partnerships and clinical trials. And because a lot of the things that they want to do, right, it really is the whole value chain, right? So really thinking about, like, so clinical trials would be essential. Like, you can't it's not just making copies. We want to kind of do enough innovation that we want to make sure that that they're properly tested, but that those trials would be done in ways that would live up to kind of authentic ethical standards, would not be extractivist, would be connected to ongoing access to care for those who are involved. And this is something that is really kind of at the heart, I think, of what they're trying to do, actually. So that making sure that clinical trials are not, it's not the constant Gardner kind of discourse of pharma and Africa, but is instead, I think that's part of too the why the African ownership, but also why South Africa is a problematic example here. But that it's like, we're not just extracting from you in order to make money on the global market, but actually trying to serve the local market, and we'll be accountable to those people because we'll still be here. We won't just kind of up and leave. And so, yeah, but absolutely clinical trials are a key part of it. And one of the things, though, that is striking, so an additional benefit that many African scientists point to, in addition to access to populations with relevant diseases and so on, is also the real strength in zoonotic disease tracking and stuff. And I think that actually helps. That's a really exciting area of the research that is less developed. And actually, Nigeria has excellent zoonotic disease tracking. And even in Ebola, I mean, Nigeria was able to control Ebola, unlike its neighbors. And a big part of that was because of strong diagnostics and really good, kind of genetic tracing that they could do, which Sierra Leone didn't have the capacity to do. And so whether there could be some growing on that.
Yeah, that there is that narrative about COVID, the effect of COVID in Africa, and this is something I'm kind of picking up from the media and maybe just the media narrative that Africa, the death rates from COVID were not as high as expected because they have really fabulous public health and they're very good at dealing with pandemics, or maybe because they just weren't they weren't being recorded, they weren't reaching hospitals.
Yeah, I think, and also, of course, the age profile is another thing that people talked about a lot, which is, people talked about, well, it wasn't as protective as anticipated in India, but India is older as well. So there, I think that there's more than one thing going on, for sure. And so part of it is about how to count, part of it is about the particular transmissions. And I guess maybe that's another reason why South Africa becomes so important to the story. I mean, one of the things that South African scientists talk about is the way that they've been penalized so harshly for contributing to science. So, because they reported the emergence of Delta, they got a really punitive travel bans and all of these things that, if that had been discovered in some other country, and actually their neighbors had the same travel bans, and their neighbors wouldn't have discovered the new variant. So really trying to make it be not so punitive to do the surveillance. Like, it's a real disincentive to do surveillance.
It's like Spain and the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought Delta was from India, but that's probably the Asia Pacific version of the story. We've actually got a question from Karina Traits, who our SSN coordinator, who is actually South African, and whose sister works at Afrigen.
Amazing.
Yeah.
I did know that, actually.
Yeah,
This has come up before, yeah.
Yes, yeah. Karina would love to hear Laura talk a bit more about the ethnographic views of IP and legal IP, whether they conflict. So thinking about IP from an ethnographic versus a legal perspective, as in your Hoodia work, and whether or not that translates usefully in the case of pharmaceuticals. And she's actually also asking me about my research I've done with Marty Reed and Smith, an anthropologist, on an Indigenous medicine and looking at regulation there, which is research that's just being written up at the moment. So, yeah, Laura, do you want to take up that Indigenous or ethnographic views of IP question?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way different Indigenous communities think of intellectual property, right, is not the sort of legal definitions, right? It's more Indigenous knowledge. It is sort of their intellectual heritage, right? It's so in terms of it's sort of asking different people how they have much different interpretations of intellectual property, and it's much more the sort of the heritage. And then that versus legal definitions of intellectual property was novelty, non-obviousness. And so they're often divergent viewpoints. But an interesting connection that comes up to Anne's work that I wanted to mention, so this gives me a good excuse, is that so I don't know, you might have made this connection, Anne, but the director of Afrigen, Patro Tablanche, right, was also the executive director of CSIR's biochemtech unit, that was the unit that patented the chemical composition related to the Hoodia plant. And so she was instrumental in kind of activating those connections with the pharmaceutical industry in the case of Hoodia, with the pharma industries in the global north, to try to get them to help and partner with South Africa and CSIR and kind of do that knowledge transfer, help them develop what was considered the P57 drug at the time that was based off of Hoodia. And so it's interesting kind of to see then and think about how the patenting of Indigenous knowledge related to the Hoodia plant might also be kind of one of those legacies that is a part of this story in terms of pharmaceutical making, because the Hoodia story and the controversies over the patenting of that were also a story about kind of trying to develop and patent drugs within South Africa. But it was much different because, right, the manufacturer, it wasn't manufactured, it was only in drug trials, and the production was plant material on the continent in terms of South Africa and kind of the Northern Cape where they were trying to develop Hoodia plants. So there's an interesting story to intellectual property, and I think with her, it's an interesting connection, right? I think between those two stories.
Small worlds, yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to respond to that first and then you go to that?
Yeah,
I mean,
sure.
so yeah, I mean, I think Petra actually learned a lot from the experience of Hoodia. And I mean, she's very interesting to talk to about these topics. And so she's, so her background, I mean, she has very diverse background, but including in the, governmental Council for Scientific and Industrial Research. Oh, good. You guys have a CSIR too.
CSIR, but we put an O on the end. I don't know why. We call it CSIRO, like CSIRO.
Okay. In India at CSIR, and many places at CSIR. In South Africa at CSIR. And so they and this is in a lot of ways that one is a very limited success, right? So on one hand, there was some benefit sharing or like kind of agreements reached, and there were some various things that were like partial success, but it was a failure not only because the drug wasn't eventually commercialized, and so all those benefits couldn't be shared or whatever, right? There were no benefits to share. But also the kind of solidarities were not fully convincing, right? So it wasn't experienced. I think your account reveals this, and many and others too. Abanase Osare, for example, too, would talk about, there's something of if you want to make sure that it is actually like going to be a democratically oriented thing, it takes more than it just being either connected to government or stuff that there's a lot of a relationship that has to be developed, and I think that there's been a lot of progress, I guess, kind of in that space.
Yeah, so yeah, this is it's a really good question, Karina, and it's brought everyone's work together really nicely. Yeah, so I am just finishing up and moving into publishing a project, ARC funded project, where I'm with my postdoc, who's now at Monash University, but Marty Reed and Smith. We were looking at a Indigenous bush medicine in the Kimberley, so a plant that has really good anesthetic properties, so it's really good at reducing pain. And the Aboriginal community has been working on this for decades with various different scientists, with like drug discovery people and environmental scientists to look at wild harvesting and so on. So I was just brought on to look at the recording oral evidence of traditional use, and then working with our FDA, the TGA, the Therapeutic Goods Administration, on how they would interpret and accept oral evidence for traditional use. So, I mean, all these questions about like markets, trust, and knowledge are all like swirling around here. And it kind of gets to, how do we recognize Indigenous knowledge? How do we allow Indigenous people to commercialize it? So, I mean, definitely this is about benefit sharing, but I think even more it's about in a way, like benefit sharing has come maybe like a intermediate position, and then we just want Indigenous companies to be doing it themselves. It's like an analogy to sovereign manufacturing as partly as well, but that requires the regulators to kind of come to the table and try and understand how do we recognize Indigenous knowledge in a way that protects the public, which is their job, to protect the public. So, I mean, one thing to say about that, which is very different from what you're talking about with Hoodia and with Majula, which is the medicine that I'm looking at, it's a traditional medicine, and there's a different pathway for traditional medicines within the TGA, and I presume in South Africa as well, which is developed for Ayurvedic medicine and Chinese medicine. So it's funny, we're kind of going back to this like parallel tract of southern knowledges. So it's the kind of medicines that you're talking about are never going to be part of that track. I'm thinking.
I mean, I guess in theory there could be some traditional medicine that becomes one of these, but that doesn't seem to be the path that is most common, right? I mean, most drugs are not based on traditional knowledge.
Well, not anymore, but I mean,
Exactly,
most of them have been. Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting difference. And just the other thing I would say was that so there are an increasing, I was just at CSIRO recently talking to their in their manufacturing division, they have a group that is working with Indigenous companies to develop products that are based on local plant products, mostly around cosmetics initially, because of the regulation.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
A lot of them are really keen to move into traditional medicinal products. Where was I going with that? Oh, that's right. So anyway, we had a big conference last year on this, and I met some really great, there were quite a few kind of Indigenous startups now, and one company, really dynamic young people running it. They had started to build their knowledge and to build their business experience. They're actually a cannabis company, so they were doing cannabis products, and then but hoping to then use that capital then to be able to do that long work of developing traditional medicinal products.
Yeah, and that kind of path is common in many parts of Africa as well. So, for example, with this green pharmaceutical manufacturing, one of the scientists who used to work at Temba Pharmaceuticals, the company that was at the basis of my second book, he's working on agricultural products first, because you can get the machines all working, you can get like all this stuff, make fertilizer, because fertilizer is quite easy to get through regulatory approvals. And then once you've got like all of these technicians who are good at making fertilizer, and you've got the machines and you've got everything, then it's like you can start to kind of build the capacity that toward the more challenging, beyond cosmetics, beyond vitamins are also a common thing that people use, right? So it's like vitamins are easier to get approved than pharmaceuticals. So by using those, you might be able to build that infrastructure.
Yeah, are there any more comments in the room or in the Laura, did you want to jump back in on anything before we let you go to bed?
No, I'm good. I think is there any more questions in the chat or?
Yeah, no, I think we've exhausted the chat. Anyone, any other last comments here? Yeah, well, that was such a exciting conversation. And yeah, such an interesting cipher through which to look at all of these big questions about global health. And yeah, just I think we are seeing it, just such a transformation in global health, to rather than being the recipients of actually being the people who are generating ideas, generating products. And partly it is, yeah, it's the end of the international post-World War II order, which is, incredibly scary. And also the demographic shift that we're seeing, and the economic shift of middle classes all over the place. So it's scary and exciting to be following your work and following the planet that we're all circulating on. So yeah, let's thank Anne and thank Laura for talking your comments. All right, and we do have a talk coming up in April from Professor Catherine Bennett, who is one of our own at Deakin, and that's